Good morning and welcome to Lund Population Day for the fifth time. My name is Martin Dribe and I'm the director of the Center for Economic Demography, and we are the organizers of Lund Population Day together with the Lund University Population Research Portal at the medical faculty. And the center has been in operation since 2006, and we are both a research group at the School of Economics and Management and also a network center for population researchers at the three faculties, social sciences, medicine, and the School of Economics. In addition to Lund Population Day, we organize bi-weekly seminars, and we also manage a couple of larger data infrastructures that all affiliates have access to. And we welcome all population researchers to become affiliates. So if you're not already an affiliate, you can just go to the homepage and find information and how to become one. This afternoon, we will have presentations from Lund researchers, population researchers on different topics, not a coherent theme this year. And we will be in the other side of this building, so when you come to the entrance to the left, as far down as you can get. For those of you who registered, there will also be lunch served just outside of here after the talk. But now I will leave the word to Johan Sandberg from the Department of Sociology, and he will introduce today's keynote speaker.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Martin. Yes, it is both a professional and personal privilege to introduce today's keynote speaker, a truly outstanding scholar, Professor Douglas Massey. Professor Massey is the Henry G. Bryant Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs at Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. His career spans decades of excellence, cutting-edge research resulting in literally hundreds of published books and articles, focused on international migration, demography, urban sociology, and Latin American societies. Almost becoming half Latin by now. He has won numerous awards and has over 113,000 citations and an H index of 143. Professor Massey is co-editor of the Annual Review of Sociology. He's a former director of Princeton's Office of Population Research, one of the premier demography centers. He's also former president of the American Sociological Association and the American Academy of Political and Social Science. Ladies and gentlemen, give a warm welcome to Douglas Massey.
Well, I'm happy to be here. I have a personal connection to Scandinavia. My grandparents on my mother's side were immigrants from Finland. And my grandmother was an ethnic Finn from the north of Finland. My grandfather was an ethnic Swede from the west of Finland. And they met in Butte, Montana at a coal mine, at a copper mine, and were married there. So that's kind of an American story. Since I'm half Finnish, naturally I speak Spanish. America's sad experiment with race relations began in 1619 when the first Africans arrived on the shores of Virginia. And over the next 350 years, the United States evolved social, economic, and political structures basically designed and evolved so as to exploit, exclude, and subjugate people of African ancestry. Then institutions that did this changed over time, but they always existed. In the early days of the colonial period, It was a series of court decisions in colonial courts that started to define the rights of blacks and whites and define the principles of black inferiority and white superiority. And then when a series of court decisions became cumbersome, they resorted to legislation and passed systematic bodies of law defining the rights of blacks and whites and establishing the parameters of a slave-owning aristocracy, the slave-holding society. And of course, when the United States was formed as a nation under the Constitution of 1789, race was embedded within the Constitution of the U.S. Not in any overt way. It was hidden, but it was embedded nonetheless. And if you want to understand why U.S. politics are so strange today, it's because the U.S. has a constitution that was written by slaveholders. And it was written so as to make it impossible to ever overturn slavery through constitutional means. They gave tremendous powers to minorities to block change. And to change the Constitution requires 2/3 of the legislatures and 3/3 of the states to make any constitutional amendment. And that was designed to prevent free states from ever overturning slavery in the slave states. And of course, slavery did not end through a constitutional process. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which outlawed slavery, did occur through constitutional process, but it was with the Union Army occupying the South, and the Congress purged of Confederate slaveholders that the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments were passed. And then over the next 25 years after the Civil War, there was a very brief period of movement towards equality that was reversed starting in 1877, and a new system of racial subordination was set up in the South called the Jim Crow system, which legalized separation and institutionalized at all levels of Southern life black inferiority and white superiority, to the point where it was possible to murder a black person and not be charged with murder if you're white. And that's the ultimate power, isn't it? And until 1900, most of the subjugation and exploitation occurred in the South. 90% of all black Americans lived in the South, mostly in rural areas. What transformed race relations in the United States was the mass migration of blacks out of the South and into other parts of the country that occurred after 1900. To the point between 1900 and 1970, we went from 90% of African Americans living in the South to about half living outside the South, and mostly in urban areas outside the South rather than rural areas. And that's when my subject really took hold. I've been studying racial segregation for a long time, and this is a book I wrote in 1993, American Apartheid, Segregation and the Making of the Underclass, and it tells the story of how segregation came about in the United States. When blacks moved into the cities like New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Baltimore, Chicago, Milwaukee, in the early 1900s, massive numbers of immigrants from Scandinavia. My grandparents arrived in the United States as immigrants in the early 1900s. And Italians from Italy, Catholics from Poland, Jews from the Russian Pale, Slavs from Yugoslavia, and so on. They're all arriving in the United States during a period of mass industrialization, and levels of segregation were rising for all these groups. And of course, immigrants don't settle randomly when they arrive in a town or city. They go where other immigrants live. And so levels of segregation went up. And they went up for Italians and Poles and Jews, and using the standard index of segregation, the index of dissimilarity, which goes from 0 to 100, where 100 means complete segregation between two groups, and 0 means complete integration, where the two groups are distributed evenly across neighborhoods in a city or metropolitan area. And at this time, levels of segregation for Italians and Poles and some of the Jewish groups would reach 50 or 60 by 1910 or 1920. But over the succeeding generations, as the second generations came to dominate, and as the ethnic groups moved up the economic ladder, levels of segregation came steadily down. Until by 1970, my colleague Richard Alba, from now at CUNY, City University of New York, Graduate Center, wrote a book called Italians into the Twilight of Ethnicity. they blended into American society and become part and parcel of the social structure of the United States. Blacks came into the city at the same time, but they were treated very differently. As they came in, what had been modest levels of segregation steadily rose. There were blacks in the North. 10% of blacks did live in the North in 1900, but they'd been there for a long time. They were descendants of free blacks. Most of them were products of intermarriage somewhere back in their ancestry, so they were lighter skinned. And although there was prejudice against them, and they were certainly not treated equally, they're not highly segregated. But as poor black sharecroppers arrived in U.S. metropolitan areas progressively after 1900, levels of segregation really hardened. And the color line, which had already existed but was permeable, suddenly became very, very hard. And levels of segregation for blacks, like those for Italians and Scandinavians who are coming into the country, levels of segregation went up from, they were about 30 to 40 in the early, around 1900, and then they rise to 40, 50, 60. But unlike the European groups, they go from 60 to 70 to 80 to 90, and rise to levels of segregation that have never been experienced by any other group in the history of the United States. And so really the 20th century, from 1900 to 1970, the predominant force shaping American urban areas was the creation of the Black Ghetto and the expansion of segregation. So that's the story I'm going to talk about, the creation of segregation in the United States, and what the trends are, what's happening now, and what the consequences are for Black Americans even to this day, and the overt racism that continues to pervade American society in ways that have only become more obvious in the age of Trump. So I'm going to talk today about some of the papers that I've written. This is 2 papers, The Changing Bases of Segregation in the United States, and my most recent paper on segregation in post-civil rights America. And I'll update this, the latter paper with data from the 2020 census, which has just become available. So this describes segregation in the United States at 3 different levels, 3 different geographic levels of analysis: at the state level, at the county level, and at the neighborhood level. And then the dotted line at the last half of the graph, that's at the municipal level, across municipalities. And that data only becomes available about 1950. So you can see that in 1900, blacks were segregated from whites at all levels. Most whites never came in contact with a black person because they all lived in the rural South. And most white people didn't live in the rural South. But the great black migration of the 20th century shifted the levels of segregation. So you can see levels of segregation at the state level, the solid line, and the county level, the big dash line, went down. But as levels of segregation at the county and state level went down, as blacks poured into northern states and northern cities, levels of segregation at the neighborhood level went up from 0.6, or this is a 0 to 1 scale, but it's the same index, the similarity. From a scale from about 60, it ends up to around 78 across these metropolitan areas that we're studying here. And then in 1970, we get to the civil rights era, and the levels of segregation began to go down. And you notice also that in 1950, levels of segregation across municipal boundaries began to increase. In 1950, there were no majority black cities, large cities. Between 1950 and 1970, during the post-war period, there was a massive exodus of whites out of central cities into suburbs, subsidized by the government, by the Federal Housing Administration loan program, and other subsidies, from which blacks were excluded by law and by practice. And blacks poured into the central cities, filling up the houses they vacated. But once they occupied the neighborhoods in the central cities, they were subject to a process known as redlining, where they were colored red in federal maps and could not be given any kind of federally subsidized loans. In fact, they were excluded from lending entirely. So built into the structure of American life and built into the structure of urban America was a progressive decline and decay of central cities. No other outcome was possible. It was all built into public policy and private practice. So it was foreordained that between 1950 and 1970, Central cities in the United States would become blacker. As they became blacker, they would be subject to systematic disinvestment, and they would go downhill and deteriorate. That was all foreordained. And that was something that was peculiar to African Americans. And you see that how this is happening with the little dashed line. We get segregation at the municipal level, because now segregation is not just across neighborhood boundaries, but across municipal boundaries. The quintessential example is Detroit. During this period, Detroit goes from majority white to majority black, and you end up with the chocolate city vanilla suburbs phenomenon, with suburbs being white and the inner city being black. And once you're segregated at a municipal level, you're segregated at a fiscal level, and disinvestment becomes easy. So the Detroit school system has no money. The Detroit Public Works has no money. The city government has no money. And all the money is in the suburbs. And so you're fiscally segregated as well as socially segregated from the rest of society. And that's what befell the United States between 1950 and 1970. And that was built into private practice of real estates and built into in federal law by federal regulations and federal practice. And so that's why you have the urban patterns you see in America today. So this looks at the index of dissimilarity, 0 to 100. Another index is the index of isolation, which I'll refer to as well. And that's the degree to which blacks live in all black neighborhoods. So this is at 3 different levels of analysis. So you can see the state, the county, and the neighborhood level. Back in 1900, then the average black lived in a state that was about 35 or 36% black, and lived in a county that was about 45 or 50% black. And then as black migration out of the South occurs, those levels of segregation drop, and as we see, isolation within neighborhoods goes up. It peaks in the early 1900s, goes down a bit, and then goes and comes back up and peaks in 1970 when the Civil Rights era kicks in. Until 1968, it was perfectly legal to discriminate against a black person in the housing market. You put a sign out and say, we don't rent or sell to black people, or use some less congenial language. And until 1974, it was perfectly legal in the United States to deny blacks loans to mortgage house to buy a house. Until 1977, it was perfectly legal in the United States to redline black neighborhoods, color code them red, and deny the neighborhoods entirely any access to credit or capital. And 1977, it's within my memory. I was a graduate student at Princeton in 1977. So these are things that occurred in my lifetime. Now, when Nancy Denton and I wrote the book American Apartheid back in 1993, we were writing it as an entry into the so-called underclass debate. There's a big debate going on about why this poverty in central cities was becoming so permanent, so obdurate, and why it was becoming intergenerational. And the drop in black poverty suddenly stopped and didn't go down any further. And the inequality began to turn around and start to go up in the 1970s. People began talking about whether we had a permanent underclass in central cities. And the debate was between the right, people like Charles Murray, who said, well, the U.S. has this welfare system that incentivizes idleness and bad habits. And that's why blacks have all these terrible problems in the central cities. And then on the other side was my colleague and friend at University of Chicago. I taught at University of Chicago from 87 to 94. Was Bill Wilson, William Julius Wilson. And he said it was the economic restructuring of central city economies, away from manufacturing, away from unionized jobs, creating a 2-tier service economy with high-paid, high-skilled jobs at the top and low-paid, low-skilled jobs at the bottom. And that's what caused the problems for Black America. And while there was no truth to Charles Murray's argument, when we got rid of welfare under Clinton, Black welfare didn't improve. But there was some truth to Bill Wilson's talk about the structural change in the economy. But neither one of these people were paying any attention to the fact that blacks were uniquely segregated and that the ghetto had been constructed for the sole purpose of excluding, isolating, and subordinating African Americans. And that's why we wrote American Apartheid, to bring that into the debate. So the irony is not lost on me. Back in 1992, 93, 94, we were having debates at the University of Chicago. It was Massey-Wilson debates. And so Massey, the white guy, was arguing the importance of race and segregation, and Bill Wilson, the black guy, was arguing the importance of class and describing what was going on. Bill Wilson is kind of a friend of mine. He took a little offense at the time, but he subsequently come around to admit that he had underestimated the power of segregation. So, and I think that the book was effective in making neighborhoods and segregation a big part of the explanation of what was happening in America. When I wrote American Apartheid, I got a lot of flack. People saying, "Oh, you're exaggerating, Doug. America's not like South Africa." And I didn't have the data at the time, but the data now do exist. And I later calculated index of dissimilarity in the United States and South Africa, averaging across cities for which the data were available. And as you can see, the solid line is South Africa and the dashed line is the United States. As you can see, the different systems of apartheid were structured differently, but they achieved the same end. Levels of segregation were high, and they really didn't begin to depart until 1970, when the US did have a civil rights revolution that began to make some effect. So for most of American history, we really talked about race as a binary, black and white. There were a few Asians in the West. Once we annexed the northern 40% of Mexico, there were Latinos in the United States, although they weren't called Latinos then, they're just called Mexicans. But they were minor players in the racial drama of the United States. It was mostly a black-white binary. After 1970, things really changed. And there was a transformation in the demographic structure of the United States, as well as the economic structure of the United States. Beginning in the 1970s, there was the downturn, downward trend in inequality, and income for the United States reversed, and inequality skyrocketed, and the average income stagnated. Rich people got richer, poor people got poorer. At the same time that this was going on, the United States was transforming demographically in terms of its ethnic and racial composition. So the top line there is the percentage non-Hispanic white in the United States, going back to 1960. So I was born in 1952. In 1960, I was in third grade. And when I was in third grade, 85% of the United States was non-Hispanic white. I lived in a town called Olympia, Washington, which is the state capital of Washington State. There were no black people in town. Well, actually, there was one black person in town who was a blind black man who lived in a hotel downtown, and he tuned all the pianos in town because he had perfect pitch. But that was the only black person. And I've subsequently learned that my hometown in Olympia was what was called a sundown town, had a sundown law, which meant that they had a law on the books that said all blacks had to be out of the city limits by sundown. And so that's the world I came out of. And you can see that this really started to change around 1970 with a massive increase in the Latino population and a smaller but also important increase in the Asian population, and not much happening to the black population, and of course the non-Hispanic white population went steadily down. A lot of people say it's because of the 1965 Immigration Act that changed the composition of the United States. And that's partially true. Prior to 1965, Asians were banned from the United States. Couldn't enter at all, or in very tiny, tiny numbers. And then the 1965 Acts repealed the quotas that had blocked Asians from entering the country and opened up the system to people from Asia and Africa and other parts of the world. And people think that that also opened up the gates to immigration from Latin America. But actually, that's not true. The national origins quotas that blocked my grandparents, and were trying to block my grandparents from coming to the United States, and were blocking Asians from coming to the United States, never applied in the Western Hemisphere. They never applied to the Americas. And the 1965 Act actually put the Americas, the Western Hemisphere, under a numerically limited system and put the first numerical limitations on immigration from Western Hemisphere. And so a lot of the Latino immigration that immigrated after 1965 and especially after 1976 was out of status and were undocumented migrants. And so that really changed the tenor, changed the perception of Latino immigrants, because after increasingly in the 1980s, the population was undocumented, illegal. And if you're illegal, by definition, you're a criminal and a lawbreaker, and you're easily framed as a huge threat to American society. And so the process of racialization of Latinos really took off in the 1980s and 1990s. And I saw it unfolding in real time in my professional career. So you can see now, in 2020, the percentage of whites, non-Hispanic whites, is 58.7%, and it's headed down to less than 50%. And the percentage of all minorities together is 41.3%, and the lines are due to cross sometime in the next 20 years. And this is the basis of the racialist reaction, the nativist reaction, the racist reaction we're having in the United States, and helps account for the rise of Donald Trump. If you look at U.S. history, there's been native reactions at various points in the 1840s, in the 1880s, in the 1920s, and again now in the 2000s. In the 1840s, it was the arrival of Catholics, German Catholics. After the revolutions of 1848, there was a lot of Catholic migration out of Germany, and of course the Irish were arriving, and they were denigrated as not fully white people, and they were subject to vicious exclusion. And so what triggered the nativism was the fact that it was a period of economic inequality when the economy was in trouble. Whenever you get these two things happening at the same time in American history, rise in economic insecurity and rapid change through immigration, you get a nativist reaction. The next time was in the 1880s with the Chinese. The next time was in the 1920s when it was Southern and Eastern Europeans. And now it's Asians and Latinos, especially Latinos in the United States. Although, as my colleague Richard Alba has pointed out in his recent book, it doesn't make much sense because Latinos are not like African Americans. If you look at the rates of intermarriage between Latinos and non-Hispanic whites, they're extremely high. And if you look at the products, the children of these marriages, they are moving in white society in ways that were not possible for blacks in the past. And so this false color line that has been imposed, it does not really exist except in the minds of people who watch Fox News and listen to Tucker Carlson, who every night gives an address, an essay on replacement theory, basically arguing that there's a Jewish conspiracy to bring in brown people from south of the border to change America and take it over and turn it into a socialist republic where minorities will be given welfare and the white people will be taxed to pay for it. And this is about a third of the country believes this nonsense. So this shows trends in segregation, actual trends in residential dissimilarity between blacks and whites. So the top line is dissimilarity, the dashed line, the blue line, is the P-star isolation index. So that gives the percentage black in the neighborhood of the average black person. So you can see there's been a steady decline in segregation over the past 50 years. And this is the 50 largest metropolitan areas with black populations. So back in 1970, the average black person lived in a neighborhood that was 65% black, which is really an average, a median between lots of neighborhoods that are 100% or 90% black, and a very small number of neighborhoods who have 0 to 10% black and very little in the middle. And the dissimilarity index was about 78. And since then, it's declined at about 5 points per year, as you can see. So there has been some progress. And what's happened in the United States is there were changes in law. As I pointed out, the '68 Fair Housing Act outlawed discrimination in rental and sale of housing. 1974 Equal Credit Opportunity Act outlawed discrimination in lending. And the 1977 Community Reinvestment Act outlawed discrimination against black neighborhoods. Those all laws happened. It didn't stop the discrimination, but it did make it go underground and make it a little less pernicious. But the civil rights era was accompanied by attitude change among whites. If you look at public opinion data, early 1960s, majorities of all whites, not just Southern whites, all whites, believed in segregation as a matter of principle. They believed that black people should be going to different schools. They believed that white people had a right to keep black people out of their neighborhoods. They believed that blacks should be sitting in the back of the bus. By the 1980s, after the civil rights era, the percentages supporting these principled segregation had dropped to single digits. So they stopped supporting segregation in principle. But the same public opinion polls show that although they abandoned the principle of segregation, that didn't make them feel easy about living with black people. And they still retain lots of anti-black negative stereotypes. And what this means is that in places where there are very few blacks, you can have integration because you can integrate without having to live with black people. So Tucson, Arizona, the levels of segregation have dropped dramatically. But Tucson, Arizona is 3% black. So in a completely desegregated world, every neighborhood is 3% black. And you don't have to live near many black people, even if total desegregation occurs. That can't occur in Milwaukee, which is 30% black. So if you desegregate the Milwaukee metropolitan area, every neighborhood would be 30% black, and that makes white people way too uncomfortable. So we'll get to this later. You get a real division between some places where there's rapid declines, other places where they're not changing very much. These are the most segregated cities in America in 2020. And as you can see, this is the index of dissimilarity. And the level of segregation is trending downward very slightly, but is still very high. Generally, when you look at the index of dissimilarity, a segregation index of 60 or more is considered high. And as you can see, they vary narrowly between about 65 and about 85. And so that's very high levels of segregation. And there's really, it'll take years to desegregate at this rate. And these are the places with the large black ghettos with the serious problems and the concentration of poverty. So Newark, Milwaukee, Detroit, New York, Chicago. The most segregated metropolitan area in the country is now Milwaukee. For years it was Chicago. But all these large metropolitan areas are very highly segregated and continue to be highly segregated. And these are levels of isolation in the 10 most isolated metropolitan areas. Again, you see fairly high levels of isolation where most blacks that live in majority black neighborhoods, the average black person lives in a more majority black neighborhood, which has, again, means that most blacks live in 90% black neighborhoods. A few blacks live in very small percent black neighborhoods, and there's very little in between. And so the means are misleading. This shows the trends for Hispanics, and you can see the dramatic difference between Hispanics and blacks. So the level of segregation on average in the 50 largest Hispanic metropolitan areas is only in the 40s. And it rose to about 48 in the year 2000 and then trended slightly downward. But really, almost that's all could be sampling error for all we know. It's really not a trend at all. The only real trend is the increase in neighborhood isolation. So if you have massive immigration, immigrants are moving into the country in large numbers. They're pouring into American cities. They're going to places where other Latinos live. Places where Latinos live are filling up with more and more Latinos. So even though the levels of segregation, there's the evenness of Latino-white distributions haven't changed. Neighborhoods where Latinos live are getting more and more Latino as they fill up. And that's what you're observing here. So the isolation has increased, but segregation, structural segregation has not. This is trends in Hispanic-white dissimilarity in the 10 most segregated metropolitan areas. And here you see a story of convergence where there was a range of segregation levels back in 1970, and they've all narrowed to a very narrow band between about 50 and 60 on average. And this is the degree of neighborhood isolation in the 10 most isolated Hispanic areas. What you see at the top are no surprises. what you see at the top are Laredo, Texas, McAllen, Texas, and Brownsville, Texas. These are all border cities right across the border from Mexico, and they're 85 to 90% Mexican on the U.S. side. So you can't have any residential distribution that is going to produce anything lower than whatever the percentage Latino in the metropolitan area is. But you see in other places, there's been a steady increase in isolation outside of the border areas, and you see also very high levels of segregation in farm towns like Visalia, California, Salinas, California, and this is because Mexicans are the backbone of the agricultural workforce, and in farm towns they are increasingly comprising the core of the labor force and are increasingly isolated in all Hispanic neighborhoods. And this is Asians. You see their segregation levels are between 30, 35, and 40, very, very low. And their percentage of the population is much smaller than Latinos. And so their levels of isolation have gone up, but they're not very isolated at all. And so we really are ending up with a configuration in the United States in 2020 where we have blacks very segregated, Latinos becoming more isolated, and in some places quite segregated. And what we've seen emerging is the growing number of Latino black concentrations, where blacks and Latinos are both concentrated in similar neighborhoods, and so we're moving towards a system where the residential environments of blacks and Latinos is quite different from the residential environments of whites and Asians in the United States. And this is the level of Asian-white dissimilarity in the most segregated Asian areas, and you see just not much happening here. And this is the level of isolation. What you see at the top is Honolulu. Why is Honolulu so isolated? Because it's majority Asian. It's the only city in the United States where a majority of the people are not white, non-Hispanic whites. Well, that's not true. The border cities are not, but it's the only city where the majority are Asians. And white people there are called haules, which is the Polynesian word, the Hawaiian word for white person. And this is the neighborhood isolation. We talk about segregation of minorities, but really the most segregated group in America is white people. So this is the level of isolation for whites, blacks, Hispanics, and Asians. And as we already saw the numbers for blacks, Hispanics, and Asians. So blacks and Hispanics are becoming more and more isolated. Blacks are becoming less isolated. Hispanics and Asians are becoming more isolated. And white Americans, white non-Hispanic whites are becoming less isolated, but they're still quite isolated. Even though America is so diversified, the average white person lives in a neighborhood that's 71% white, and they really don't come into contact with minorities. If you break the data down by suburb versus central city, they're even more isolated in suburbs than in central cities. So that's the trends, that's the big picture. Now I'll talk about some of the variations on that theme, and looking at trends in segregation, look at trends in something called hypersegregation, and looking at trends by income. So this is the level of suburbanization in the United States, and you see that whites are by far the most suburbanized group, by far. The whites, on average whites, 63% of whites in metropolitan areas live in the suburbs rather than the central city. And for all the minority groups, it's under 50%. And this looks at levels of segregation and isolation in central cities versus suburbs. And what you see is that you see similar patterns, but in both central cities and suburbs for Hispanics, blacks, and Asians. But in central cities, the levels of segregation are much higher than in suburbs. And that is true whether you look at segregation or you look at isolation, look at dissimilarity or isolation. And this looks at segregation by income, by quartile, by quintile. So in the top quintile, for Asians and Hispanics, it's always been true, this is the left-hand side, it's always been true that dissimilarity levels fall as income rises. And you go from high levels of segregation to moderate levels of segregation. If you look at the black panel at the bottom, you see that in 1970 and 1980, there was no effect of income on segregation. There was no way blacks could escape the ghetto. And by 1990, for the first time, we see differentials appearing by level of income. And then you saw that big drop between 1980 and 1990. People thought, oh, things are going fast. But then it stalled, and it really hasn't changed much in 2000 or 2010 or 2020. And this doesn't have 2020 data yet. So, and the right is just contact probabilities, which are different things I'm not going to talk about. When Nancy Denton and I did our work using the 1980 census, we discovered there was a big debate about how to measure segregation, and there was a proliferation of like 20 different indices. And they were all arguing about which is the best way to measure segregation. And I didn't think there was a best way, and I thought that indices were all measuring different things. So we did a factor analysis and found that they basically, all the indices loaded on one of 5 dimensions. Evenness, which is measured by dissimilarity. Isolation, which is measured by the isolation index. Clustering, which is the degree to which neighborhoods inhabited by blacks cluster together in space rather than expand out like a checkerboard. Centralization, the degree to which minority neighborhoods are concentrated towards the center of a metropolitan area, in usually the older important neighborhoods of central cities. And concentration, just the sheer amount of space occupied by the minority group. And we found out in 1980 that in a subset of metropolitan areas, blacks were highly segregated on at least 4 of these 5 dimensions. And we called that hypersegregation. And at the time we were doing our research based on the 1980 census, this was the olden days, and to get census data on census tracts are neighborhoods of about 5,000 people. To get the data, you had to order these things called tapes. And the tapes would come in, we had to order 20 different tapes for different states, and then download the tapes. To download the tapes, you had to have an operator mount the tape, and you had to originally put data into a card reader. Later on, we could do it on computer terminals, but you still had tapes. So it took a year just to process the tapes to create a working data file. Now you just get a digitized sample with all the census tracts, all the United States, and all the metropolitan areas, and download it in 2 seconds. So it's a different world. So we were only working on the 50 largest metropolitan areas, and later on we were able to study all metropolitan areas and see. So this shows the trends in hypersegregation. So the dashed line at the bottom shows the number of hypersegregated cities where blacks are segregated on at least 4 of the 5 dimensions. And you can see that it was fairly stable and didn't change all that much through 2000, but by 2010, the levels had dropped quite dramatically. And we don't have numbers for 2020 yet. But within hypersegregated areas, the average across all 5 indices is very, very high. And these, in 1980, we didn't find any hypersegregated Latino areas, but we did find them in 1990 and 2000. And so here are black dissimilarity and isolation and Hispanic dissimilarity and isolation within the cities, the metropolitan areas. We have labeled hypersegregated. And you can see that Hispanics have gone up and become more and more segregated in these areas on both dimensions, both evenness and isolation. And blacks are coming down, and they're converging at similar high levels. It's very round there, but it's oblong in one of my shows here. So this is where in 2010 where urban blacks were living. And you can see that 46% were living in moderate segregation, 21% were living in high segregation with an index of 60 or more. And then about a third were living in hypersegregated areas, either segregated on 5 dimensions or 4 dimensions. And so hypersegregation is still with us, and we haven't got the data to do the other indices for 2020 yet, but I've got a graduate student working on it as we speak. And so this is, again, America's most segregated metropolitan areas, and this is the index of dissimilarity. And this is isolation. Basically, you've seen this all before. So now I want to talk about the persistent causes of segregation. And these I'm looking at some papers that I've done with graduate students, Jonathan Rothwell, who's now the chief economist for the Gallup organization, and Jeff Jacob-Rue, who's a professor at Brigham Young University in Utah. And these are I'll just give you the factors that are affecting segregation now. prejudice and discrimination haven't disappeared. For a while, they went underground, and people didn't openly express prejudicial views and openly express desire to discriminate. But Trump uncorked the genie out of that bottle. And now open expressions of white nationalism, white racism are fairly common. As you might have seen on January 6th takeover of the Capitol building, there were Confederate flags flying in the Capitol of the United States. The Confederate was an unconstitutional revolt against the government of the United States that killed more Americans than any other war. And there in the middle of the Capitol building, there was a Confederate flag. Even in the Civil War, there was no Confederate flag in the Capitol building. So prejudice and discrimination are still ongoing and still part of the story. What has emerged in the post-war period, especially after the Civil Rights era, is suburban density, suburban zoning has emerged as a big cause of both racial and class segregation. To the degree to which suburbs of a metropolitan area are covered by restrictive density zoning, that means you can't build multi-unit, high-density housing structures. They skew towards single-family homes on large lots. To the extent that suburbs are covered by that sort of zoning, it confines people to the central city, drives up the cost of housing, and increases segregation on the basis of class. And because minorities, particularly blacks and Latinos, have lower incomes, that perforce drives up levels of segregation by race as well. And Jonathan Rothwell and I have done instrumental variable analyses to show that this is a direct causal effect of segregation in the United States on both class and racial lines. And the age of the housing stock is a factor in predicting segregation. Places with newer housing stock that was built after the Civil Rights era are much less segregated. Once a residential configuration becomes segregated, it tends to persist, and there's a long delay in it changing over time. Places where neighborhoods were built after the Civil Rights era, after these anti-discrimination laws were passed, are less segregated. And class segregation, of course, and racial segregation are intercorrelated. So places that are highly segregated by class tend to be highly segregated by race, and vice versa. Surprisingly to many people, a military presence in a metropolitan area is associated with lower levels of segregation. The military is the most effectively integrated institution in American life. It was desegregated by order of the Commander-in-Chief, Harry Truman, in 1948. And it really, even though the president ordered desegregated units across the American military, not a lot happened until the Vietnam War, when the Vietnam War was fought by combat units that integrated. And so blacks and whites were together. And then since the Vietnam War, it really has integrated, and it's become as part of the structure of the American military. If it's a command structure, so if the command comes down, if you're going to be a racist, you better keep it to yourself, and you can't express it publicly. And you are going to be promoted or not promoted on the basis of your adherence to this norm. It desegregates the military. And so the military is one of the few places in American life where black people routinely boss around white people on the basis of rank. So General Colin Powell, who became Secretary of State of the United States, and our current Secretary of Defense, black generals. And this is typical of the military. And so places with large military bases, the military bases themselves are not segregated by order, by command. And off-base housing tends not to be segregated because they live with each other in the military. And so the military is one great equalizer for blacks and whites. And one of my former students has done research comparing the welfare of blacks and whites who are in the military, and all the usual racial differentials that you see between blacks and whites basically disappear when you look at black military people versus white military people. In the military, there's a lot of racial equality. Presence of a college or university population, people who are highly educated are less prejudiced on average, and so there are lower levels of segregation. Degree of urbanism, very large urban areas are more segregated than very small ones. That's just kind of a function of the human ecology of urbanism. a minority percentage. The higher the minority percentage, the greater the minority percentage, the greater the threat of the minorities, and the higher the level of segregation that's imposed. That was happening during the black migration. As black percentages rose, the color line hardened. Minority socioeconomic status, I already pointed out that class segregation and racial segregation are intertwined. And so I'm going to show you some of the data that backs up what I've just said. In the past, one of our big problems was we couldn't measure racial prejudice at metropolitan level. So we couldn't develop models that connected racial prejudice to segregation. We had general data from the General Social Survey, the Gallup polls, nationwide data. Well, they're on samples of 1,200 or 2,000 people. You can't develop an index for each metropolitan area. But in the era of big data, you can develop ways of looking at racial prejudice. And so about the time of the Obama's first Obama election, a grad student at Harvard came up with the idea of looking at search frequencies on the N-word, the word nigger, which is the most disrespectful term you can say about a black person in the United States. In the United States, I can't even use the word. If I were to use the word, I'd be outraged in my classroom. So I have to say the N-word. But so we did search frequencies on the N-word and tabulated them. And the higher the search frequency, we argued the greater the prejudice against blacks. And we screened out from the search frequencies references to rap songs that use the N-word all the time. So we could get rid of that confounder. And what you see here are the plots with high, moderate, and low levels of black prejudice according to this index, which we derived from Google search frequencies around the year 2010. And so you see the Northeast, the Midwest, the South, these older metropolitan areas, more dense metropolitan areas, places where the blacks were moving from and to in the Great Black Migration have very high levels of prejudice. They're less in the West. And this is the level of segregation. Just looking at the space, you see the correspondence. So the places that are red here tend to be blue here. And the Northeast, the United States, is very highly segregated. The Boston to Washington metropolitan areas, very segregated metropolitan area, a set of metropolitan areas. We tried this for Latinos. There are various derogatory terms for Latinos. None of them seemed to carry much weight, and we couldn't come up with any meaningful patterns to look at until we tried the term illegal alien. And then when we did variations on the term illegal alien, we found a lot of spatially meaningful patterns. And so you see here, it's in the West, where the illegal alien is a session of white people searching on the internet. And Phoenix, Arizona has the highest level. And Phoenix, Arizona is the most prejudiced place in the country against Latinos. Arizona is a border state, but the southern part of the state is more Mexican than the central part of the state where Phoenix is. And Phoenix was settled by retirees coming down from the north. And it's more white than the southern part of the state. And America's most favorite sheriff, Joe Arpaio, a child of Italian immigrants, became sheriff in Maricopa County in Phoenix. And he rose to fame and power and re-election by systematically arresting Hispanic people and throwing them in prison camps, creating open-air concentration camps in the parks in downtown Phoenix with people that were accused of being illegal aliens. And then every week he would march them through downtown Phoenix, dressed in their pink skivvies with pink handcuffs, marching down the street. And he became the most popular politician in Phoenix, Arizona. And if you were Hispanic, you were routinely subject to being pulled over, being harassed, you had to prove that you're an American citizen right there and then on the spot. And there's no law that requires people to carry identification saying that you're an American citizen. I can't prove I'm an American citizen. I don't carry a passport around the United States. But of course, brown people get pulled over and attacked, and white people don't. So yeah, there's some face validity to this. But when you compare the two, you do see high levels of segregation in the West, but not so much in Phoenix actually, because that's a newer metropolitan area, less segregated. You see it in the Northeast, and this is because a lot of the composition of the Hispanic population shifts regionally. So the Northeast is the only region in the United States where Mexicans are not a majority. And in the Northeast, there's no single group that's a majority, but the majority across groups are from the Caribbean. And Hispanics from the Caribbean are Afro-Caribbeans. And so this is showing the effect of race through the Latino population. So large shares of Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, and Cubans are of Afro origin, and obviously phenotypically black. And if you didn't talk to them on the street, they would be identified as black. And certainly if they appear in housing markets, they'd be identified as black. Going way back, looking at racial identity, people who identify as white, mixed, or black, levels of segregation vary systematically. So that's reflecting the racial composition of Hispanics in the Northeast. So here's the data. So you see racial prejudice, you see big effects for anti-black index and the anti-Hispanic index. See a big effect for the density permissiveness index. So the more permissive density zoning is, the less segregation there is. I've subsequently in later work shifted and recode the whole thing as for restrictiveness to put it in the same direction. Higher white minority income or the more college graduates, you see when Latinos have a higher socioeconomic status, they're less segregated. Large populations, MSAs, metropolitan areas are more segregated. The military population has a significant negative effect, as you would expect. The percent urban, more urbanized, has a negative effect. And the median year of housing, as we saw, also has a negative effect. Newer housing stock is less segregated. And then the West, we all saw that, less segregated. And the border is more segregated, and that's Latinos in the border, because by definition, they're going to be segregated. So those are the causes, at least as best we can tell. And this was 2010 data. We can't really do the analyses for 2020 because the socioeconomic data are not going to be really available at the tract level for another couple of years. We have the basic counts, so we know where Hispanics, Blacks, Asians live in 2000 from the 100% census, but all the socioeconomic data are collected on what used to be a subsample of the census, but which is now collected from something called the American Community Survey, which is a sample of about 1 or 2% of the US population. So you have to have 5 years of data. So to get 2020 data, you need 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, and aggregate it to get an estimate at the tract level. And that won't be available probably till 2023 when we have the 2022 American Community Survey done. So anyway, but that's the best we know right now. So this is the series of papers I did about the American foreclosure crisis. And Jake Rue and I got the idea of saying, well, segregation has been a big pull for the subjugation of African Americans in the 20th century. Maybe it has something to do with the housing crisis and the foreclosure crisis after 2008, when the housing bubble burst and mass foreclosures occurred and people were losing their houses. So we estimated a simple model where we looked at the log of the total foreclosures, or the log of the foreclosures per housing unit, either the number or the rate of foreclosures, with an intercept, a variation of segregation measures, and a vector of control variables. And when we did that, we found that segregation of African Americans strongly predicted not foreclosures among African Americans, but foreclosures in the entire metropolitan area. So highly segregated metropolitan areas had more foreclosures than moderately segregated metropolitan areas. And this was true whether you used the dissimilarity index or the isolation index. And this is just showing you for the absolute number of foreclosures and the rate of foreclosure, you get the same story. And these are the effect sizes for different kinds of variables. So you see that black segregation was actually the strongest of the major predictors of foreclosure across metropolitan areas. So then that begs the question of why? What's going on? And this is a function of the advent of mortgage-backed securities. Prior to the 1990s, or the 1980s it started, Prior to the 1980s, if you bought a house, you would go to a bank. You'd apply to the bank for a loan. The bank would give you the loan or not. And if you're black, you probably wouldn't get the loan. But if you got the loan, you would pay the money back to the bank. And if you ran into some problem, you could go talk to the banker and maybe reschedule your payments to adapt. But the number of mortgages was limited by the amount of capital a bank had on hand to loan. And so the number of mortgages was small, and it was confined to a subset of people. With the advent of mortgage-backed securities, mortgage-backed securities, instead of a bank lending the money, a mortgage broker goes out and sells mortgages to people, and he tries to develop as many mortgages as he can. He wants to get more and more mortgages. And then once the mortgage broker gets the mortgages, they sell them to a financial firm on Wall Street. And then the financial firm collects these mortgages and puts them together to back a security that then they sell to investors. And then the mortgage payments don't flow to a bank, they flow into a processing house, which aggregate the payments to pay off the money for the bondholders. So the bondholders get the money from the mortgage payments. And everybody makes money. So the mortgage broker makes money, the Wall Street firm makes money for packaging these things and selling them to investors. The rating firms who rate the quality of the bonds, they make money because they're paid by the bankers, by the financial firms, and they have no incentive to declare a bond as not trustworthy. So they all give them AAA ratings. And then all these people make money and they have no stake in the game. So they could give the worst possible mortgages to anybody and they'd still make money. And in the end, it's the homeowners and the bondholders that carry the risk. And so this created a new causal mechanism. So mortgage-backed securities created a huge demand for mortgages, no longer constrained by capital a bank has on hand to lend. It's only limited by the market for mortgage-backed securities, what that market can bear. And the binding constraint becomes the number of mortgages that can be generated. And creditworthiness of borrowers is not seen as an issue, because the financial geniuses told themselves that they could diversify the risk by getting a bunch of high cost, high risk mortgages and bundling them together with low cost, low risk mortgages, and they would buffer each other and reduce the risks. So it created demand for any kind of mortgage, and especially even high risk mortgages. And this transformed the structure of discrimination against black people from predatory exclusion to predatory inclusion. So now black neighborhoods became juicy targets for marketing mortgages, and especially high cost, high risk mortgages, which could be sold. And people who, if you sell a high cost, high risk, your commission of the sales fee is higher, and they want some higher risk mortgages to put in their mortgage-backed securities to diversify the risk. So it creates a hugely profitable cycle where mortgage brokers generate loans, they immediately sell them to securities firms. Firms divide the loans into tranches, so-called risk tranches, segments. They repackage the loan from different tranches into bonds that are then sold to investors. And then rating agencies give the bonds an AAA rating and believe that risk is controlled by diversification. And even if they don't believe this, they are compelled to do it because the people who are paying them are the people who are producing the bonds. And all these actors make money by assuming no risk. And investors, smart inside investors, can manage their risks by credit default swaps. This is all techno language from the financial industry. A credit default swap is basically an insurance policy against a financial instrument. So if you know that this bond that you've bought is paying very high payments on an ongoing basis, has a lot of nasty, rotten loans in it, you can insure yourself by taking out a credit default swap with an insurance company like AIG. And AIG, you pay monthly payments to AIG, and then when the bond fails, they pay off the full value of the bond. So there's no risk for you. And so the bond insiders could protect themselves in this way. And this is what happened with Morgan Stanley and Merrill Lynch. They protected themselves in credit default swaps. So this set off an intense search for borrowers, and in this context, formerly excluded clients became extremely attractive, and racial segregation of poor minorities created a natural market for subprime lending. Geographic concentrations of financially unsophisticated and historically underserved minority homeowners and black neighborhoods became easy targets for subprime lending, and they were sought out for predatory inclusion rather than predatory exclusion. And this led to a racially targeted subprime lending and a dual racially segregated mortgage market. So this shows the level of segregation on the x-axis and the spread between interest rates paid by blacks and whites for mortgages on the y-axis. So you can see the higher level of segregation, the bigger the interest rate spread for what blacks pay for mortgages and what whites pay for mortgages. And this spread can actually be used as an instrumental variable to predict segregation, and it works well as an instrumental variable. It basically shows that segregation emerges as a causal predictor of the degree of foreclosures across metropolitan areas in the United States. So, conclusion: racial segregation is an important contributing cause of the U.S. foreclosure crisis. The effect of segregation is independent of other economic causes of the crisis. The explanatory power exceeds that of other factors hitherto identified as causes, and neither the number nor the rate of foreclosures is any way related to expanded lending to minority homeowners as a result of the Community Reinvestment Act. When the crisis exploded and blacks were being foreclosed, what the right wing said, well, it's these civil rights laws. They made us lend to these undeserving black people, and this is what happens when you do that. But the Community Reinvestment Act was not responsible. Almost all the loans were made by private actors, and they were doing it on an exploitative basis. It was predatory lending. They got sued after the fact, and this created some court record, and we used this to burrow deeply into what was going on. And this is the model of what was happening. We call it the serial displacement of capital, where discrimination against black homeowners pushed them into risky mortgages, which increased the likelihood of foreclosure, which increased the likelihood of repossession. And we got a data set for the city of Baltimore, and we estimated these equations. I know you can't read these. I'm not expecting you to know these conclusions. And basically, at the top we see the borrower is black or the borrower is living in a black tract. And then we look at that effect on the likelihood of getting a high-cost mortgage and a high-risk mortgage, defined according to criteria we specify. And then we throw in and look at the likelihood of foreclosure, given that the borrower is black or living in a black neighborhood, but also controlling for whether they're in a high-cost, high-risk loan. And then we did a counterfactual analysis and looked at what would happen to black people if they were treated like white people in Baltimore. And these are the equations. And so these are the findings, basically. These are the odds of being in a high-cost mortgage if you were a black borrower compared to a white borrower. So you're 2.7%. The odds were 2.7% greater that you'd be put into a high-cost mortgage, and the odds were 2.2% that you'd be put into a high-risk mortgage. And if you're in a black borrower, and if you're a black tract, it's higher as well. And then that pushes your odds of foreclosure up. So, and then this is the financial losses if they've been treated like white people instead of black people. This is the foreclosed. They would lose. They had lost. So 45. The average homeowner, black homeowner in Baltimore, had about $45,000 of their capital at risk in foreclosure, and then the orange is. That's money that was lost already. The home had been repossessed, and they lost their money. And this is the total that was extracted out of the black community in Baltimore during the period from 2000 to 2008 because of predatory lending. So $3.5 million was sucked out of the black community in home equity that had been laboriously achieved. They'd overcome barriers to exclusion from earlier decades. They owned their houses, even though they were not worth that much, they were worth something. And that money was sucked out of the black neighborhoods. And and you weren't really protected even if you were a high-income black person, because you were actually targeted because you had more money. And the Wells Fargo Justice Department, they hired us, a civil rights law firm hired me and Jake Rue as expert witnesses. We performed this analysis, showed it to the judge, and Wells Fargo, which is the biggest lender in the mortgage boom, caved immediately and settled and paid a fine. But it was nowhere near the amount of money they made from screwing over black people. And for the systematic violations of both financial law and civil rights law, not one banker ever went to jail or was tried in court. They pleaded guilty in civil courts, paid fines, and got off. And even though the Obama administration created a fund to help homeowners stay in their repossessed houses, that fund was never used. And this led to one final analysis where this produced a record of affidavits from a variety of banks. And we did a content analysis looking for aspects of discrimination in the statements that were made as testimony in these trials against the banks. And we coded whether there was evidence of individual discrimination, which rarely happened, or structural discrimination, when it was built into the pattern and practice of mortgage lending in the firm. And then, so I want to give you a few examples just to, so there's, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip to evidence in the testimony. These are people involved in the lending industry who were interviewed as part of the trial for background and testimony. So one person said Wells Fargo market management treated a culture of discrimination. Wells Fargo discriminated against minority loan applicants by not offering them their new or better products, and which had lower or fixed interest rates. Another technique would be to tell the customer that the only way to get the loan would be to close quickly, would be to submit a subprime loan. So they lied. Wells Fargo loan officers also discriminated against minority refinance applicants by encouraging them to take out more cash on their home equity. By taking out more cash, the borrower would unwittingly increase the commission of the loan officer received on the loan, while at the same time eliminating the ability to qualify for an FHA or prime loan. So they were tricked into going to a higher cost, high risk loan. Elderly African American customers were thought to be particularly vulnerable and were frequently targeted for subprime loans with high interest rates. I could remember one instance where an elderly African American woman who was over 65 could not qualify for a subprime loan that the credit manager wanted to put her in. So the credit manager convinced her to transfer the property to her son so he could take the subprime loan. The subprime loan could be made in his name. And of course, this house was later repossessed and she lost the equity in the home. It was also the practice of Wells Fargo officers where I worked to target African Americans for subprime loans. It was assumed that African American customers were less sophisticated and less intelligent, could be manipulated more easily into a subprime loan with expensive terms than white customers. I heard employees joking with one another about the race of the customer, saying things like, "Oh, you know that guy isn't so smart. Is it because he's black?" And more of the same. Over and over, people told us that racism was built into it. Number 4 here. This is our title of the paper was "Riding the Stagecoach to Hell." The symbol of Wells Fargo Bank is a stagecoach. So one of the interviewees gave us the title for this, number 4. I complained many times about what I thought were unethical or predatory loan practices that Wells Fargo was engaged in. Managers never took any action to respond to my concerns. In my office, we morbidly joked that we were riding the stagecoach to hell. So they knew they were doing bad things, and their jobs depended on doing it, and they didn't want to do it, but they felt compelled to do it. And finally, I want to talk about one last consequence, neighborhood consequences 3, and this is some biodemography. And this looks at telomere lengths. Telomeres are chromatid pads at the end of human chromosomes. Human cells are always dividing in the course of our lifetime. And every time they divide, they take a little bit off the telomere, and that protects the integrity of the genetic information within. As people age, the telomeres get thinner and thinner. Once they get too thin, then abnormalities abnormalities start happening, and you get cancers, you get autoimmune diseases, health deteriorates. So it's really kind of a cell level indicator of future health problems. So we've developed this model where high poverty rate and high segregation produces concentrated poverty, concentrated disadvantage, and we hypothesize that has a biosocial effects on mental and physical health and socioeconomic achievement through three possible and possibly more pathways: through telomere length, by shortening telomeres, by exposure to disorder and violence, by increasing your allostatic load, that's your cortisol in your bloodstream that causes lots of problems, and through gene-environment interactions. And more evidence is accumulating to show that these three pathways are happening. We do this because historically we know that there's huge differentials between blacks and whites in terms of health, life expectancy, any indicator of health or well-being. Blacks are worse off than whites. And when you control for education and income or occupational status, you don't get rid of the differentials. And what we realized, or what we argue, is that that's because high income and education don't get blacks the same kind of neighborhood conditions that get whites. And this shows you neighborhood disadvantage index from the Fragile Families data set, a nationwide data set collected by my late colleague, Sarah McClanahan. And you can see that the distributions are really quite different. So most black people live in a far more disadvantaged neighborhood than the most white people will ever experience. So when you control for income or education, you don't get rid of this huge differential in exposure to neighborhood disadvantage. And we argued that this was going to show up, we hypothesized this was going to show up with a reduced telomere length in people exposed to high disadvantaged neighborhoods. This is a picture of a chromosome with the telomeres colored in green. Elizabeth Blackwell won the Nobel Prize for discovering telomeres about a decade ago. And after she discovered what they were and what they were for, to protect the integrity of the chromosome and the genetic information within it, she works at University of California, San Francisco, which is a medical and public health school. And she went to look at people who were caregivers of Alzheimer's patients and looked at their telomeres and discovered they were shorter, much shorter than people with the control group. And that's because it's a very stressful thing to be a caregiver married to or related to someone with Alzheimer's. And so stress has been shown repeatedly to reduce telomeres. And then that's a harbinger of later health problems. So this is the means. And sure enough, when we did the analysis controlling for a lot of variety of background, we found that the Woodkey index, which is the index of disadvantage, had a significant negative effect on telomere length. And other studies are finding the same thing. And this is the estimated effect on black telomere length. A very strong negative relationship. So the more you're exposed to a neighborhood disadvantage, the earlier, the more your telomeres shrink. And the sample here is women in their 30s. So these women don't even have symptoms of poor health yet. It's not being expressed, but it's already built in to them at the cellular level, and they're going to have future health problems. So that summarizes what I'm doing. What I've been up to for most of my career. I grew up in a town with a sundown law. I remember my high school graduation was 1970, so this was right after the 60s, the height of the civil rights movement, height of the anti-war movement. And our class speaker got up and said some very, very radical things about how the war in Vietnam was an unjust war, and that created some kind of stir. But then she said, Olympia, Washington is a white racist ghetto. And then the audience exploded. People showing, go back to Russia, you communists, get down and go away if you don't like it here. And other people saying, go ahead, Pam, tell them like it is. So that was my senior high school graduation in a town with a sundown. So I've seen all this unfold in my home country. And it's not something I'm proud of, but it's something I've studied and tried to do everything I can to eradicate without a great deal of success. So thank you. Questions, comments, challenges?
Microphone is supposed to work. Yes. Questions for Professor Massey? Thank you so much, Professor Massey, for an outstanding talk. Do we have any questions in the audience? Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for a very interesting talk, very inspiring talk. I have a question about the future. What do you think will happen? So we see some positive developments, but with polarization and what is going on now, what do you think about when you get to 2020 data or 2030 data?
Yeah, well, I may have a fancy PhD from Princeton, but my crystal ball is probably not any better than anybody else's. But what I think is clear is that we're at a hinge point where things could go either way. The 2020 election was critical, and if Biden had lost, things would have been a lot different. Just imagine what U.S. policy towards the invasion of Ukraine would be if Trump was in office. A lot of things would be a different world, and that's true with civil rights policy as well, because Trump was really anti-civil rights, very anti-black. He began his campaign by announcing that Mexicans were criminals and rapists, and we need to build a wall to protect ourselves from them. And so that set the whole tone of the whole election. So I think a lot's going to depend on the election. A third of the U.S. population believes the election was stolen, which is a lie, and a third of the U.S. population lives in an alternate reality where cities are dens of iniquity that are really violent and dangerous, which is not true. Crime rates are actually low by historical levels. The election was stolen. Jews are trying to replace us. They believe these things. Now, a third doesn't sound like much in a democracy, but we have a constitution written by slaveholders that gives these minorities huge powers to block. And all the population live on the coast. New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, California, Oregon, Washington. Wyoming has 50,000 people. South Dakota has like 400,000 people. They each have 2 senators and they have representatives, so they have way more power. And they can block things. And Rule 22 in the Senate says 60% of the senators need to vote to be able to move something to a final vote. And so, because we have a constitution written by slaveholders that makes it possible for people to block progressive change for minorities, it really overstates the power of where these racist sentiments are now located. And it's really, all the polls say we're on a precipice and could go either way. If there's control, if the Republicans gain control of one or both the houses of Congress, it'll make it very difficult for the Biden administration to move forward on any of these issues. If they retain control, it could mean significant movement forward on a variety of progressive issues. So we'll know in about 6 weeks is which way the wind blows. I mean, Bob Dylan said you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows, but sometimes you can't even tell from the weatherman. And the weathermen here are the polls, and they're very hard to say what's going on. One hopeful sign is with the Supreme Court being stacked with basically conservative evangelist Christians and overturning Roe v. Wade, that has galvanized women. And Kansas, a very conservative state, they put up a proposal to outlaw abortions in Kansas. Basically, the Supreme Court decision turned this decision back to the states, and it was defeated by 60% majority. And so that's a hopeful sign that maybe people have really had enough, even in a conservative place like Kansas. But we won't know until the election happens which direction things are going. So a lot of us are quite worried, and we could be bifurcating into 2 Americas, a blue America and a red America. And unfortunately, they're not connected in any geographic way. They're different Americas, but isolated in different parts of the country. And it's not a clean divide like the Confederacy versus the Union. Lord only knows.
So I have 2 questions really going back to the trends. So a lot of what you showed us and talked about were developments in the most segregated or the most, well, the top cities in terms of the proportions of the different subgroups of the population. So one question I have is are the patterns and also in terms of consequences similar at lower levels of segregation, or is this very much something that you only see at this, going to Chicago and Newark and these places, or can you find places also further down, let's say the segregation line, and see similar negative effects of segregation? And the other thing which is a bit related is, so these tracks, about 5,000 people, you said, is the long-term development, is it even possible to study segregation within those tracts to see if there is the trends towards less segregation is also present if you would go to, let's say, real functional neighborhoods?
Yeah, well, the last question first. Yeah, you can measure things at the block level, or the block group level, measure, and when that's done, you get different levels of segregation, but the trends don't change. So when you go lower, you get higher levels of segregation. When you go higher, you get lower levels of segregation, but the overall trends really don't change very much. In terms of the effects of segregation, it really does depend on the intensity of the segregation. So places where blacks aren't segregated, you don't see the same kinds of problems. And in particular, you don't see the same kind of concentrations of poverty and disadvantage. You don't find neighborhoods like the disadvantaged neighborhoods in Chicago or Milwaukee or Philadelphia and other metropolitan areas with lower levels of segregation. And the black welfare is much better in these areas. The trouble is that the disproportionate share of Black America lives in these highly segregated circumstances and under conditions of very high concentrated poverty, very high concentrated disadvantage, high levels of exposure to disorder and violence. And disorder and violence, we're discovering, has big effects because it drives up the level of allostatic load. So you're constantly being infused with hormones that are fight or flight responses, especially cortisol. And cortisol has powerful effects on cognition. So it has been well established that exposure to violence in your neighborhood reduces attention span, reduces achievement on testing, intellectual testing, has health effects. And these are all built into the environment that a large share of blacks are subjected to because of segregation, that the blacks outside of these areas don't experience to the same degree.
Thank you very much. That was super inspiring. I have a question, which is actually good news from this perspective. I just saw somewhere that the trends in interracial marriages is really going up in the US, and I wonder just how would they fit into your trends, but also like how do the kids that emerge from those interracial marriages identify themselves? So I read like these papers about the GSS panel where people were kind of unstable in like their identification of race, right? So especially for Hispanics. So I wonder, is that a thing, or is that maybe just exaggerated? Thank you.
Well, it depends on what you mean by interracial. So levels of intermarriage are very high for Asians and very high for Latinos, much lower for blacks, although compared to historical levels, they're much higher. But, and they're highly gendered. So there's high levels of intermarriage between Asian women and non-Hispanic white men, but not between non-Hispanic white women and Asian men. And for blacks, the intermarriage rates are much higher for men. Men are marrying white women than for black women, who seem to be kind of at the low end of a hierarchy in terms of dating and marriage. One of my former graduate students has just published a book using like Tinder data and showing systematic bias against black women in Tinder and these dating apps. And you see that in the marriage data. So it really, black-white intermarriage rates have changed. They've gone up. There are more multiracial people of black and white ancestry, but they were much smaller than the mixed marriages, products of mixed marriage of of Latino and Asian. My latest book is called Young, Gifted, and Diverse: The Origins of the Black the New Black Elite, where we analyze data that we collected in 28 selective colleges and universities around the turn of the century, around 2000. And we collected a lot of background data, and we document the fact that in these elite environments, educational environments, the black populations are extremely diverse. Immigrant origins are way represented, biracial origins are way overrepresented, upper class origins are way overrepresented, and the black population is very diverse. And the whole book explores how the experience of blackness on campus varies depending on whether you grew up in a segregated versus integrated neighborhood, whether you have a black or a white parent, whether you have immigrant parents or not. And the experiences are very diverse, and the outcomes are quite diverse as well. The biggest cleavage is really gender. Black men are siphoned into the criminal justice system by criminal justice policy. So on day one of presence on these elite college campuses, one of the campuses we sampled was Princeton. That was before I was there. On day one, black women outnumber black men by 2 to 1, and black men are way underrepresented in the elite, and they're the most disadvantaged group in American life in a lot of ways at this point, and that's true more generally. Men are kind of falling by the wayside, and a majority of college students in the United States are now women, and nobody talks about it, and a lot of conservatives are against affirmative action, but in point of practice, in a place like Princeton, there's affirmative action for men. When I graduated from high school in 1970, I looked out in the labor market where entire sectors were reserved for guys like me, white, male, Protestant. Law, medicine, architecture, college professors, even blue-collar jobs reserved for white guys in unions. That's all changed. And white men talk a good game about being tough, but it's when they start having to compete with women and minorities, they seem to fold, and then go whining to the racist side and say, oh, it's because they get all these benefits, when in fact they've just given everybody else a chance. And one thing we know from psychology is the phenomenon of loss aversion. People hate losing things they've got, advantages they have, money they have, and so there's a reaction when they feel losses, and white men feel a loss, especially working class white men. And that's driving a large part of their revolt in the United States against the so-called elites.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I have a couple of questions. The first one is on sort of what's the way forward in terms of sort of going against these trends in segregation. What kinds of interventions would you think would make a dent and really change those trends for the better? And the second one is more on the sort of the research agenda. What do you think that we don't know about segregation that needs to be studied? Maybe you have some opinion about the situation in Europe as well.
Well, I've kind of followed what's going on in Europe, and levels of segregation are nowhere near as high as they are in the United States, but they are significant in some places. And the patterns of segregation in Europe tend to be quite different. So in Europe, you tend to have segregated public housing projects on the periphery, and the core of the city is reserved for native white elites. Like in Paris, the banlieue are all on the outskirts, and the core of Paris is white, and it's very white. But you go on the subways, you see all the help coming in the subways, in the metro, and then they go out at night. And the level of segregation is actually quite high in a place like Paris. And another one of my former students did a meta-analysis of discrimination using audit studies, testing studies from all over the world, wherever they're available. He found the highest levels of discrimination in the labor markets are in France. The French are quite resistant to the idea that they're racially a stratified society, and they won't let you even measure race, and they don't want to talk about it. When American apartheid came out, I invited to give a talk at the Sorbonne in Paris. And I got up and talked about, American apartheid, I talked about America. And at the end of my lecture, some old professor gets up in the back and says, I do not know why we have to learn about this. These are Anglo-Saxon problems. We don't have these problems here in France. So I was thinking, oh God, this guy's really clueless. So in terms of what to do, we've never really enforced the laws we've got on the books. So if you look at the history of the Fair Housing Act, the original act was co-authored by Walter Mondale and the only black senator at the time from black senator from Massachusetts, who was a Republican back then. The Republicans were the party of Lincoln and pro-civil rights. And it had very solid and important enforcement mechanisms within it. And as a compromise to get the legislation passed, to declare that discrimination in housing was against the law, they removed all their enforcement legislation. So the enforcement measures are really weak and very ineffective. And so it would really take a reforming practice to do that. And interestingly, when we published American Apartheid in 1993, that was the first year of the Clinton administration, and Clinton appointed Henry Cisneros as his Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. He's a Latino from San Antonio, Texas. And Cisneros read American Apartheid and invited me and Nancy Denton to Washington, D.C. to brief the senior staff in Housing and Urban Development and talk to the Deputy Secretary for Enforcement. And they were designing a program to test for levels of discrimination in the cities we identified as hyper-segregated. They're going to go out and test and find where the discrimination was occurring, find out who's doing it, and then target enforcement to those areas. And that was moving along until the midterm elections, when the Senate went from Democrats to Republicans, and the Republicans started defunding housing and urban development. And then Henry Cisneros got in trouble by giving cash to silence his mistress, and then he was out of office, and pretty soon the whole thing unraveled. So there was a moment of hope there. There was also a moment of hope at the end of the Obama administration. The original Fair Housing Act in 1968 had something called the affirmative mandate, and it gave the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development the power to compel municipalities to develop plans for how they were going to desegregate, how they're going to promote integration in their municipality. And if they didn't develop these plans and do something about it, they could withhold funds. This was in the original bill, which was put into action in the Nixon administration. And the original Secretary of Housing and Urban Development was George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, who was from Michigan and was a very pro-civil rights person. He tried to implement the affirmative mandate, but Nixon fired him. And because it went against his southern strategy of placating racists in the South and placating prejudiced people in the North. And so the affirmative mandate was never implemented by any administration until Obama wrote regulations to implement it in his second term. And they were scheduled to take an effect in the new Hillary Clinton administration, and they would have taken effect, but the Hillary Clinton administration never happened. And upon entering office, the Republicans tried to pass legislation that would have prohibited the federal government from collecting data on race and making it available to the public at the census tract level or at the block level. So there's resistance all the time, and you have to be cognizant of the resistance and try to move forward as best you can. One promising avenue that's having an effect are housing mobility programs that are set up, where you take people that are poor and minority, and you give them the means to move into better neighborhoods that are more integrated and more advantaged. And these show that you can dramatically improve people's lives and produce modest increases in integration by the use of these housing mobility programs. Often involve housing vouchers, where you give vouchers to poor people to move into integrated, more advantaged neighborhoods. And I've done a study in New Jersey. There's something called the Mount Laurel Doctrine, which under the New Jersey Constitution, the Mount Laurel Doctrine says you cannot write zoning regulations that prohibit the building of affordable housing in your community. So there's a tool in New Jersey to promote this. and it's moving forward. And we did an evaluation of a public housing project that was built in an affluent white suburb of Philadelphia on the Jersey side of the river, and showed that you can build a 100% affordable housing with 140 units, 90% Black and Latino, put it in the middle of an affluent upper middle class white area, and you will have no effect on taxes, you have no effect on crime, you'll have no effect on property values, and yet you give the people that move into this project a huge step upwards in their mobility, and their kids get to go to a much better school system and move upward. And so this can all be done without negative externalities for the hosting community, and it provides a big benefit to the people, but it's a very hard sell to suburban America.
One last question.
Okay, so I just want to tag on to the first question. This is more about, I guess, policy or analysis of the political situation in the US rather than research. So, I mean, if I understand you correctly, I mean, you pointed out the midterms coming up, that they're going to be very important in terms of Biden's ability to keep this train rolling that he has started. But I'm wondering, I mean, the US has a long history, which you clearly showed here, of a pretty consistent trajectory towards more and more segregation, worse and worse conditions experienced by the minorities. So I'm wondering, like, do you really think that even if we imagine a situation where the Democrats would win the next 5 presidential elections, they would keep the House, they would keep the Senate, do you really think that the political ambition is really there to do something that would pervasively, fundamentally change things in the United States?
I think the potential is there, but it won't just fall like a ripe apple from a tree. It's going to require mobilization and effort because of the way the Constitution is written to give minorities powers to block. And of course, they've got this Republicans have this built-in advantage given the Constitution, and that's not enough for them because they can still lose. And they don't want to be in a world where they can still lose. And so now they're moving forward with overt efforts at voter suppression and election denial. People are running on a platform of overturning their state's electoral count in elections, and that's very dangerous. We're moving forward pretty much like Viktor Orban did in Hungary. We're just manipulating the mechanisms of state to create an authoritarian system where losing is impossible. And that's a possibility, and a lot hinges on what's going to happen in the next couple of years. And so sometimes I'm hopeful, other times I'm depressed. I drink a lot to survive sometimes. I'm half Finnish, so you know how it is. So we'll see what happens. It's always been 2 steps forward and 1 back when it comes to race. So we fought a civil war, ended slavery, and we had a movement forward during Reconstruction, and then we moved back. And then there was a whole 2 or 3 generations of exploitation. And then we moved forward in the 1960s with civil rights laws. That made a big difference. And a lot of us, we elected a black president. But now there's the reaction coming in. And the reaction happens for some time, and then that gets overturned, and there's movement forward again. So if you look at the long term, yeah. But in the immediate term, it's very unclear what's going to happen.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's give a round for Doug Massey. Thank you so much, Doug.